Greetings, everyone. Today, we're having yet another webinar, and our topic today is stigmatization and other barriers for military service members in receiving medical aid, consequences for Ukraine. Our lecturer today is Mr. Thomas Britt, PhD. Our lecture will be taking place in the following format. So the lecture itself will last for about 1 hour, and then we will have 30 minutes for questions and answers. You can write your questions down in the general chat, or you can raise your hand. There's a raised hand function on Zoom, and I will give the floor to each and every participant who has a question. Just a reminder that we have simultaneous interpretation during the webinar. If you want to access simultaneous interpretation, find a symbol of the globe at the bottom of the Zoom screen and pick the Ukrainian channel if you want to listen to the Ukrainian interpretation, or 3 dots, interpretation, and the Ukrainian channel. Our webinar today will be recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. If you are interested, you can also give us your contacts and we can provide you with a link to the recording. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Thomas.
Great, thank you. So should I go ahead and start, Oksana? All right, wonderful. Well, I certainly appreciate this opportunity to be here today and to talk about an issue that's near and dear to my heart that I've been working on, since for over 20 years. And that is the stigma and other factors that influence whether soldiers who are experiencing mental health problems.
Військовослужбовці, які мають проблеми з психічним.
Next slide, please. And so the issue that we face here is that, and I know I'm preaching to the choir in terms of an audience of behavioral health professionals, but there's enough evidence now that when military personnel are exposed to combat, that these types of traumatic events, as well as the mundane stressors that they encounter from day-to-day life, can have a negative impact on their mental health. And a large minority of soldiers develop mental health problems as a result of their service in the military. And we also know that there are effective treatments. So the military, the U.S. military, has evidence-based treatments that can help soldiers deal with these difficulties and then get back to work. But of course, the problem is that a majority of the service members with a mental health problem don't utilize these treatments. They don't get help for these treatments. And so, or they start treatment and then drop out because it's not consistent with their mission and their ability to return to be part of their unit. And when service members fail to get treatment, of course, their symptoms can get worse. And then not only do they have a mental health problem, but this can extend to their family members and more severe consequences. So next slide, please. In terms of work with the military, with the U.S. military primarily, there's different statistics that have been put forth, but I think a pretty accurate percentage of service members who admit to having some type of mental health problem is 30% of those who are exposed to combat. And Carl Castro, who's on the line, and Amy Adler, they found that this number goes up to 40% for those soldiers who are more in direct contact with the combat events that are happening and traveling outside of their base camp. In the U.S., we have a pretty large reserve component force who basically does the military in a kind of part-time way. And when they come back from a combat deployment, they may immediately go back into their civilian lives and lose that social support from their unit. So the rate for reserve components is nearing 41%. And I would like to emphasize that this is only among those service members who are willing to admit they have a problem and want to get help. The percentages are probably much higher than this. And the other thing is that we know that there are objective events and stressors that are associated and really are the best predictors of service members developing mental health problems. And these include how much combat exposure the service members have experienced, whether they're on an especially long deployment of, let's say, a year, and if they've been on multiple deployments. All of these are linked to a greater likelihood of service members having a mental health problem. Next slide, please. When I was thinking, and unfortunately, I have not had the time to dig into this as much as I would like, but just thinking about the situation being faced by Ukrainian service members in dealing with this war, this incursion by Russia, they certainly are encountering unprecedented, probably, levels of traumatic events. Given the sustained periods of combat that they have to experience, the fact that they're being attacked on their homeland and seeing key treasured sites and structures and areas destroyed, and the effects of that. The Ukrainian service members are fighting a war where they're severely out-resourced by the enemy. And also there's the sense of kind of lack of control, where the ultimate success of the operation depends upon resources that are provided by other countries, such as ammunition, weapons, artillery, etc. So I would argue that the level of trauma being experienced by Ukrainian service members is probably on the very high end, and therefore it would not be a surprise at all that a decent number of Ukrainian service members are struggling with mental health problems. Next slide, please. In terms of so we should be on slide 5 now. There we go. Thank you. In terms of the question of, do service members get treatment for their mental health problems? It's hard to come up with a specific estimate of the number who get treatment. A couple of papers in the 2000s thought it could vary between 13 and 40%. We took a slightly different approach and asked a large sample of reserve component soldiers about the severity of their mental health problem, whether they considered it a mild problem, a moderate severity problem, or a very severe problem. And you can see here that only 24% reported treatment if it was mild, but a much larger percentage reported getting treatment if they considered their problem severe. But you could look at this statistic and say, well, this still means that 30% of the service members who have a severe mental health problem have not received any help for that problem. Next slide, please. And so when we ask the question of why don't service members get help, one of the first reasons that military psychologists studied was the stigma associated with getting help. And there's been a lot of work in the civilian area about different types of stigma associated with having a mental health problem and also getting treatment for that problem. And one of the first areas studied was a public stigma And that is that oftentimes the general public has a negative attitude and negative beliefs and discriminates against people with mental health problems. Probably the biggest one for military personnel is this self-stigma, where you've internalized these negative attitudes and believe that you're less of a person if you either admit a problem or get treatment for that problem. And therefore, the easiest way to avoid being labeled and feeling bad and being discriminated against is to avoid getting treatment, because then you decrease the likelihood of stigma. Next slide, please. I initially became interested in this, like I indicated, over 20 years ago when the US military was involved in a peacekeeping mission to Bosnia. Some of you may remember that, that operation. And I was helping to set up a procedure where service members coming back from the operation would be screened for either a medical problem or a mental health problem. And what happened was, if someone screened positive for a medical problem, they stood in one line. And if someone screened positive for a psychological problem, they stood in another line. And it soon became clear which line was for the medical problem and which line was for the psychological problem. And the service members were making fun of people in the line for the psychological problems, calling it the loony line and making other comments. And so we kind of did a study on the spot to look at the stigma of admitting a problem and getting help. And we did find that the majority of service members did think that admitting a psychological problem would harm their career, possibly, and cause them embarrassment. The other thing we found was when the service members were actually talking with a provider, there was more discomfort when they were talking with a behavioral health provider than when they were talking with a medical provider. And they also expressed a lesser likelihood of following through with a referral to get mental health treatment. A couple years after that, Charles Hogue, again, Carl Castro and others did an important study where they were looking at the combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they found again that there was the report of a stigma associated with mental health treatment. And worse than that, the people who had mental health problems were the most likely to report a stigma with getting treatment. And that's a finding that has been replicated a couple of times. Next slide, please. Around 2009, 2010, we decided that although stigma is one factor that may affect whether service members get treatment for mental health problems, there probably were many other determinants that were not adequately studied. So we did a series of studies where we did focus groups with soldiers of different rank. We did interviews with soldiers who made the decision to get treatment. And we generated what we thought was a comprehensive set of factors that could influence whether military personnel received mental health treatment when they were having difficulties. And you can see on this slide the first 7 determinants. And you can see for number 1 and number 2, we make a distinction between the stigma of admitting a problem leading to an actual career problem, and then also being treated differently by your fellow unit members because you have a mental health problem. We also felt it was important to talk about the positive aspects of treatment, that it could work, it could improve their lives. Many soldiers also endorse operational impediments, number 4, where they basically don't have the time to get mental health treatment because of the operational tempo and the desire to not be away from their unit, causing other members to have to pick up their slack. We also felt it was important to directly target, do soldiers have these stigmatizing beliefs about their fellow unit members who get treatment? So you can see the item, I would not trust a soldier to have my back if I knew he or she were receiving treatment. Another issue is that many service members might have negative attitudes about the treatment process. So they might believe that they're going to have to talk about their childhood and talk about their parents and bring up a lot of things they would rather not bring up. And if they are prescribed medication, they might be worried that they could get addicted to the medication or that the side effects might affect their performance. Next slide, please. And then the remaining two factors were treatment facilitators, where if the fellow unit members were supportive, then that could be a factor that would increase the likelihood of getting help. And then a very important one that we found in a couple of studies. Of course, military personnel in general, I assume in Ukraine, as is the case in the US, they like to handle problems by themselves. And their first course of action, if they have a problem, is to try to figure out the problem themselves and try to find a way to handle it themselves. And of course, this is fine if the coping strategies work and the service member is able to address problems on their own. The problem is when they try this approach and the symptoms don't get better and they develop into more severe problems. So self-reliance as a factor is an interesting determinant that can be both positive and negative depending upon how successful it is. Next slide, please. So another way that we looked at this, so if you think about wanting service members to get the treatment that they need so that they can improve their well-being, the service member likely goes through a series of stages. So someone who recognizes I have a mental health problem, they might not even think about treatment. They might be focused on dealing with it themselves, hoping it goes away, and not even considering the possibility of treatment. And then you have service members who are considering treatment, but for whatever reason, don't make the decision to go get it. And then the third group here is the service members who actually have received treatment. And so what we did was of those 9 factors that I just talked about, we looked to see which ones were important in moving service members from one stage to the other. So when we looked at what distinguished soldiers with a problem who had not sought treatment, but at least considered it, you could see here that positive beliefs about treatment and fewer negative beliefs were the main factors that distinguish people who at least were considering mental health treatment. Also, a lesser preference for self-reliance and lower stigma. When we looked at what distinguished people who were considering treatment but had not sought it from those who actually sought the treatment, what was interesting, the biggest factor that came out were these operational barriers to care. So many soldiers might be really considering mental health treatment, thinking it can work, but if they don't have the time to get treatment and their schedule is too busy to fit treatment in it, they're not going to actually follow through and get the help they need. In addition, the lesser preference for self-reliance and lower stigma also distinguish people who ultimately receive treatment. Next slide, please. So up until now, I think, and I think the field in general initially failed to appreciate the organizational culture of military personnel and the types of units they're embedded in, and how this culture and climate might affect whether military personnel actually get help for their mental health problems. And so back in 2012, Anna McFadden and I, we kind of talked about these characteristics of high-risk occupations like the military, and how this organizational culture could be an impediment towards military personnel getting the help they need. So you can see these different factors that we're really all aware of. Within the military, service members are supposed to be both physically and psychologically fit. They're selected because of their resilience, and the ability to be resilient is emphasized. Obviously, military personnel care a lot about their small units and don't want to let their battle buddies down, and are heavily influenced by the beliefs and opinions of these units. For military personnel, work is often a central part of who they are, and so anything that would take attention away from their work, such as getting help, could be discouraged. Of course, there are behavioral health professionals in the military, but especially combat soldiers have a really strong in-group identity, and perhaps even if the behavioral health providers are uniformed, they might not be considered as part of the in-group of the combat arms soldiers. And then finally, it could be the case that treatment, as has been determined to be effective in non-military samples, might just be too lengthy and too long-term for the soldiers who want to be a part of their unit. So therefore, this overall culture can have an impact on whether military personnel get the help they need. Now, in order to look at this in more detail, we published a study a while back about the importance of a unit climate of support for mental health, and made the point that if soldiers are embedded within a unit that supports the recognition of mental health problems and supports soldiers getting help when they need it, and then supports them returning to the unit and not making negative comments, that this climate of support could have a positive impact on the level of stigma the service members feel, and some of these other barriers that we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. And I think I just talked about this unit climate of support. And so next slide, please. And so what I have up here are a couple of items that address this unit climate of support for mental health. So soldiers in my squad know how to help a fellow unit member. Soldiers in my squad would support a unit member. And this measure has 6 items on it, all getting at this perception of support within the unit for mental health. And so we made the prediction that if soldiers were in units where they felt supported, they would be likely to experience a decrease in stigma. They would have more positive views towards treatment, and they would have fewer negative views towards treatment. Next slide, please. And I realize this is kind of a busy slide with a lot of arrows on it. But if you look over to the right-hand side, the box on the right-hand side, and you see the unit climate box at the top, you can see that the unit, that among those soldiers who felt that they were in a unit that supported mental health, those soldiers have experienced a reduction in career stigma, a reduction in being treated differently. They had more positive beliefs about treatment, fewer negative beliefs about treatment, and reported fewer practical barriers for treatment. So, and this were changes in these variables from time 1 to time 2. So believing in that you were embedded in a unit that was supportive of mental health, that was associated 3 months later with lower stigma, negative perceptions, etc. Interestingly, none of the barriers that are seen at time 1 predicted a change in unit climate from time 1 to time 2. So therefore, we really did have support for that was consistent with the importance of the climate for the unit as a predictor of lowered stigma and improved attitudes towards actually getting help. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about a very important topic related to the stigma of getting mental health treatment, and this is the issue of the emphasis on resilience and how that might affect soldiers getting mental health treatment. And I think what can happen is when service members feel that resilience is expected, where something's wrong with them if they experience a mental health problem, even if they've been exposed to high levels of combat, that they think they still are supposed to be resilient, that can prevent the service members from getting the help they need. So one of the things that we've argued is that what should occur is the leader and fellow unit members should argue that getting mental health treatment early, before the symptoms become severe, contributes to resilience, because the sooner you can get treatment for emerging problems, the faster you can return to your unit and help your unit accomplish its mission. And I do think that the culture of resilience in these types of high-risk occupations like the military does deter treatment seeking. And I think if we can emphasize, again, that early treatment is a contributor to resilience and not a failure of resilience, then we can normalize service members getting help for problems that have been caused by these objective, severe events that they've experienced. And ultimately, like many other things in the military, all of this is a leader responsibility. So leaders need to be in the formation talking about the importance of early treatment for mental health problems and not doing things to stigmatize those soldiers in your unit who need mental health treatment, or else their problems will get worse. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we wanted to do, especially after seeing the importance of the unit in determining the level of stigma that service members feel, is to develop training for the unit that would improve the amount of support provided to soldiers with mental health problems. So you can see here the different areas of the training we covered in terms of how to tell if your fellow unit member is having a mental health problem, being able to talk about the benefits of treatment, trying to help them overcome barriers. In the US military, there was a concern that soldiers were being accused of going to mental health treatment to get out of work, and so they were malingering. And so what are the dangers of doing this? Well, we made the case that because of the stigma associated with mental health treatment, it might be less stigmatizing for a soldier to say, oh, I'm going to behavioral health, but I'm just trying to get out of this assignment that I've been given for later this afternoon. And that's less stigmatizing than saying I'm going to behavioral health because I need help with a mental health problem. In this training, we also talked about understanding mental health treatment and medication, giving more accurate information, and again, establishing a positive climate within the unit. And the format of this training, the service members said they were tired of PowerPoints. They didn't want PowerPoint slides like the ones I'm providing you all here. And so it really was discussion oriented. But we also had videos of soldiers who were talking about the benefits of treatment and the barriers that can possibly come up. And this is, Oksana, where I'd like to show that video. So if you guys could stop sharing, and I'll share my screen with the video. See if it lets me do it. Okay, here we go.
That was my biggest barrier, my self-pride, thinking that it was like a mission or something that I could handle on my own without seeking help. I'm a really just man. It was me finally breaking down, listening to everybody around me, and finally going to get the help that I needed. I think my biggest barrier was career progression and what my leadership and superiors were thinking. But then as I realized they were good with it and they went along with it, they were actually willing to let me get the help. I realized that it was going to be a lot better.
I went in there with the stigma that mental health was something you didn't want to get kind of shunned by your peers or subordinates to find out, oh, that guy's doing mental health, he's going to be crazy. Once I went in there with I try to go in there with open mind, but you never really go anywhere with no mind. Say I'm going in there with no mind, but you still kind of shut in. And it took me a few weeks to realize that this was helping and that I should keep my mind open and learn the coping skills.
I also was kind of reluctant to seem weak or, as a dependent of something instead of fixing it myself, which I just self determination to fix something. So, push to go to somebody else instead of doing it. It was good.
I'm sorry, Tom, we can't hear anything.
Oh, no. Okay. I'm sorry about that. Well, you basically the soldiers were talking about the barriers they encountered and how they overcame the barriers. So all three of those soldiers that were featured, they all had made the decision to get help. And so they were talking about the stigma that existed, but kind of how they overcame that stigma and what actually got them into being able to get the help they need. So my apologies for the audio difficulty. So if you guys start, you can start sharing the presentation from where we were. Great. And importantly, in addition to the soldiers getting the training, we also developed a separate set of training for the leaders in terms of their role in creating a positive climate within the organization. Next slide, please. And so this was basically the example video that I just showed. And that was one of about 8 different videos that we put together for the training. Next slide, please. And so one of the things we did to evaluate this training, we had soldiers from 2 battalions and 61 squads. You can see here 349 soldiers. And we assessed them at baseline, and then 3 months later. So before they got the training, they completed a measure of knowledge of mental health, their unit support for mental health, and stigma and attitudes. And soldiers were randomly assigned to either receive the unit training or to a survey-only control group where they completed the baseline and 3 months later surveys. And you can see here, 3 months after the training, 270 of the 349 completed the 3 month follow-up. And we were able to get, or 270 members of the unit, and we were able to get match data for 111 soldiers. And we also included a computerized test of attitudes towards mental health treatment and versus medical treatment to see if implicitly service members viewed mental health treatment more negatively. Next slide, please. So one of the findings that we were struck by was how many of the attitudes at baseline that the soldiers had towards mental health treatment were not positive. So if you look at this slide, the biggest response was neutral. So the medications prescribed by mental health providers are usually addictive. A small percentage disagreed with that statement, and the majority either were neutral or agreed. Mental health treatment works. Again, a majority of people were neutral to disagree. Medications are not a good way to treat a problem. Same thing. Getting mental health treatment could hurt my security clearance. A majority disagreed or neutral. And the same thing with getting mental health treatment would lead me to getting discharged. For that one, there was a greater percentage of disagreed, which was positive. So as a whole, this indicated that there was more education that was needed for the service members. Next slide, please. Another finding from the baseline survey was that their soldiers in general did not report a high frequency of talking with fellow unit members about mental health problems or helping fellow unit members about mental health problems. So if you look at this, slide, you can see that only a minority, 30% reported having a conversation with a fellow unit member about a problem. Only 25% had talked with someone about getting help. 28%, only 28% offered assistance to a soldier who was struggling, or tried to challenge negative comments or provide support for a soldier who was currently in treatment. So one of the main goals of the training was to increase the number of supportive behaviors like these that were executed in the unit. So next slide, please. And to that effect, we did find that the training was effective. So if you look at 3 months after the training, those who received the unit training reported a higher number of supportive behaviors at the 3 month time period compared to baseline. Whereas in the survey-only control group, there was no difference between the baseline and the follow-up. So the training was effective at increasing the number of supportive behaviors that were shown to service members who may be struggling. Next slide, please. We also thought that the training might be effective at helping the service members themselves be more willing to go get mental health treatment if they had a mental health problem. And so we did find some suggestive evidence for this. So if you look at this slide in the survey-only control group, 7% had received mental health treatment in the 3 months after the training, whereas in the unit training condition, 21% had, so 3 times the number. And the chi-square was marginally significant, whereas there were not differences in treatment seeking at the baseline. So some suggestive evidence that the training might have made the service members feel more comfortable getting help themselves. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the results for the implicit attitude test. For those of you who are not familiar with this test, if you look at the picture, you can see there's a term that comes up in the middle of the screen, great, and you hit an X if that term is consistent with good. You hit an M if that term is consistent with bad. And the idea is that it will be easier for people to associate words with the category that their opinion matches. So in this case, great is more likely to be, it might be more likely to be associated with medical treatment being paired with good than being paired with bad. What we did find with this test is that the results of this implicit association test did show that the soldiers had more negative attitudes towards mental health treatment compared to medical treatment, that they viewed mental health treatment as worse and they viewed it as less effective. But unfortunately, we did not get differences as a result of the training. So the training was not able to have an effect on these more implicit attitudes about mental health treatment versus medical treatment. Next slide, please. So I think in terms of the training, at the baseline, the soldiers did report that they were confident that they could help the soldiers, even though they did not report engaging in a lot of supportive behaviors. I think one positive aspect of the training is it did lead to an increase in the number of supportive behaviors. And also the training received positive evaluations, and the soldiers reported making changes based upon the training. Next slide, please. I did want to talk about some of the implications of this whole area of thinking and research for how we approach mental health treatment with service members and other employees in high-risk occupations where work is an important part of their identity and they want to get back to work. A couple of points that we've made is that the training or that the treatment that service members received can be targeted towards managing the implications of the effects of these traumatic events that they're constantly experiencing, as opposed to trying to resolve, addressing unresolved issues that might have occurred years ago. We think that if the emphasis is on the treatment of the symptoms that are a result of the combat and other factors, that the soldiers might be less willing, more likely to get treatment and less likely to drop out. Obviously, we've talked about the importance of fellow unit members and leaders expressing support. There is evidence to deal with the issue that a lot of evidence-based treatment have 12 sessions with a week in between sessions. There is evidence that some briefer forms of evidence-based treatment can be effective. So 4 sessions that are targeted. And obviously the better the briefer the treatment, the more likely the soldiers will be to actually get the training. And then there's some interesting research lately that shows that people, if the treatment itself is focused on getting employees back to work, then in fact, employees do get back to work faster. And there's no negative effects on the mental health of the employees. And then finally, in the U.S., there has been a these dates are a little dated, but there's been an attempt to embed the behavioral health providers with the primary care doctors in order to make getting treatment easier. So I believe all of these factors will hopefully help service members get the treatment that they need and the treatment they deserve. And I have my last slide where it should be on slide 26, and I have my email address here, so which is twbritt@clemson.edu. So if anyone has any questions that they want to send me online about any of these areas, then I'd be happy to correspond with you and kind of send you, I could send you the information, the training that we developed. But I'm also happy to answer any questions from anyone in the audience now as well.
Hey, Tom, this is Carl. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I have a question. Maybe you can comment. Oftentimes, there is this focus on mental health stigma, which is, as you've shown, for well over 22 or 2.5 decades, not to date you or anything. I'm dating myself as well, I guess. But there's also a stigma associated with physical health. And I know that your early work showed that the stigma is, I think, quite significant, is not as high as the stigma associated with mental health. Can you comment on just overall this focus on just health more broadly and how there are different types of stigma around health in general? I think that would be really important, especially in these prolonged type of combats where there's this huge physical toll as well as a psychological toll, because as we all know, they interact.
Right, exactly. That's a great question, and I was going to try to find the article, but probably around 5 years ago, we published a paper in the British Journal of Psychiatry where we were comparing the stigma associated with, explicitly compared the stigma associated with mental health problems versus physical health problems. And we did find that the differences were not as pronounced as was the case in the 2000 study. So I think that, because people will say if I break my leg or if I have a physical, it's going to keep me out of work just as long, and it's going to potentially prevent me from keeping my flight status. And so there is I think it's fair to say that, there were some differences between the specific types of barriers for physical versus mental problems, but I think there's also concerns that service members have about getting help for physical problems that they think might negatively affect them and their ability to contribute to the unit. So the focus should probably be on, getting help for any difficulty that's affecting your quality of life and not letting obstacles prevent you from doing that.
Can I start asking questions? Because I have a collection.
Sure.
1, 2, 3, 4 questions that I have. These are people who are not present but they wrote their questions beforehand, so they have not heard your presentation. Я буду читати українською, так, тому що оригінал.
I will be reading them out in English because I received these questions in Ukrainian. On multiple occasions, I faced situations when people pretended that they were mentally sick to avoid combat missions. So they feign that they are hurting, that are feeling bad. How can we deal with that? Because basically it decimates the entire idea of military service as such. Thomas, did you hear my interpretation?
I'm hoping that's going to be translated for me.
Oh, I can translate myself.
Oh, okay.
Okay. This guy is writing that he has met not once such accidents, such cases when people pretend that they are sick in order to avoid doing the combat. And they simulate that everything aches and that they feel bad. And he asks how he can tolerate this, because his idea is that it destroys the idea of military service as it is.
That's a great point, and I'll just say that concern is also present in U.S. military circles, and there's probably a distinction between when you're being selected for service and exaggerating your level of mental health symptoms versus when you've actually served and been exposed to combat. I do know that the behavioral health providers that we spoke to said that let them determine if the soldier is malingering. Let them determine if the soldier is lying. It's not your job to do that as a leader. So their response was still encourage them to come to behavioral health. If they happen to be exaggerating their symptoms, we'll be able to pick up on that and we'll tell them to go back to work, basically. But that is a big issue in the U.S. military as well.
Mm-hmm. Можна я спитаю у дівчат-синхроністів, як мені робити? Мені кудись перемкнутися, там читати питання, а ви перекладете, тому що я не зрозуміла, як мені правильно поводитись. Оля, скажіть, будь ласка. Попросіть Тома. Ага. Tom, can you please switch on English channel? This is from interpreters. Yeah, this is the sign of the globe at the bottom of the page.
I'm sorry. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Switch to English.
Can you hear me now? Thomas, can you hear me right now?
I can, yes.
Okay, so you will hear English interpretation here. I was interpreting, but you were not on the English channel. Hence, you did not hear the interpretation.
Okay, I'm sorry. So do you mind in the one that she just indicated?
Everything is fine, so we will just continue. Okay. We will continue now.
Okay.
So I will be reading another question in Ukrainian, and you should be able to hear everything in English. Okay. What are some of the systemic activities that we can take to reduce the level of the to reduce the influence of the stigma? So what can we do to minimize the influence of the stigma?
That's a great question. I think, first of all, the obvious answer is not to use stigmatizing language to talk about people getting help, not to discourage showing up for mental health appointments. I think the positive things we can do is for leaders to, in the formation with the soldiers, to admit that the unit has been through a lot. There, especially in situations where there's been heavy combat and exposure to trauma, and it's not unusual for soldiers to have difficulties with that, and therefore getting treatment should be encouraged. And there's also evidence that if you get help for a problem when it's minor, you'll be able to return back to the unit quicker. It doesn't mean that everyone needs mental health treatment, but for the leader to normalize that people can have difficulties with these types of experiences and that help is available and encouraged to be utilized, I think that goes a long way in terms of reducing the stigma.
Мгм. Thank you. Так, читаю наступне питання.
Let me read out the next question. Asking for help might contradict your perception of yourself as a man. It's not a masculine thing to acknowledge that you have a problem because you want to rely on yourself to resolve these issues. So basically, I guess what is meant that most men are more prone to rely on themselves to have their issues resolved. How can we combat that?
That's a great question, and that speaks to the dimension of self-reliance that I talked about. And the Black American soldier in the video, he was basically saying that was an impediment for him. He didn't want to admit to himself that he was weak. But one of the things we try to do is use an analogy to physical health problems. You know, if you sprain your ankle, you might try to use ice to bring down the swelling and to take care of the problem yourself. But if your ankle continues to swell and to hurt, you've got to get help in addressing the problem. And the same thing is true for mental health difficulties. Of course, we've been trained and probably culturally, and then there is also masculinity issues as well, with men being an emphasis on handling the problems yourself and not getting help. But I think that recognizing the level of exposure to trauma, and if you try to handle it yourself and you're just not able to, then it's better to get help for that problem than to let the symptoms get worse and to have the soldier potentially lose their marriage and have a bad relationship with their children and have their whole quality of life affected. But that certainly is a big barrier.
Так, останнє питання, яке у мене тут є. Таке є враження, що є
It seems that there are civilian psychologists who work in their offices and do not see the war. There are people who are afraid of working with veterans because they don't know how to do it. It's a problem. Do you have anything to recommend how we can tackle that issue?
That's a great question. I know that in the United States there is a similar concern, and in the U.S. we have uniform behavioral health folks, but then we also have civilian psychologists, and there is training that these civilian psychologists can receive on, you know, what is it like for the service members that they might be seeing? What are some of the experiences that they've had? What are some of the issues that they've had? So that they can at least be able to empathize with what the veteran, the service member has been through, even though they themselves have not participated in the operation, have not participated in combat. And that's called different things, but depending upon the organization, but it's basically designed as training for civilian behavioral health providers to realize the unique experiences of military personnel, and really, like you say, to increase their efficacy at being able to provide appropriate treatment, because we certainly don't want our civilian providers to be reluctant to offer mental health services to those in need if they can be provided with information about some of the experiences and what they'll likely encounter.
Дякую. Це всі мої питання. Ще раз питаю аудиторію.
So these will be all of the questions that I collected. Maybe we have more questions from the people who are present at the lecture today. They can write in the chat. Thank you for your speech. This is so very interesting and some very interesting research that you talked about. I wanted to add that if any of those who are present wants to ask the question, you can raise your hand and I will allow you to speak, or you can write in the chat. I was listening to Tom and I was thinking that this is also an opportunity to us to listen about something about military culture and also the fears that civilian specialists may have in dealing with the veterans.
I do see one question that popped up by Adriana.
Пані Анастасія, вам можете говорити.
Anastasia, you can raise your question, please. Good afternoon. I have a question. What is your attitude to the fact that now we have a lot of servicemen who go study psychology? Do you think they will make it? Will they become psychologists? And what could be the reason for such a movement? Thank you.
Well, I can only kind of guess or hypothesize, but my sense is probably the military members who have gone on to be trained to be behavioral health. They've seen the importance of, they may have experienced problems and recognized that there's a shortage of people who are able to provide help. They probably witnessed their battle buddies having mental health problems and might have felt a little bit impotent at being able to help in the way that they wanted to. And so my sense is by going to get training, they feel like that's a way that they can give back and contribute to the mental health and well-being of those who fought with them. I think there's a similar dynamic in the U.S. military with I'm not sure of the exact numbers of veterans who ultimately decided to pursue a behavioral health career, but I do know that kind of dynamic also happened in the United States as well.
Прочитайте чи мені прочитати Q&A? Так, давайте я тоді читаю. Питання від Адріани.
We have a question from Adriana. Can we get any materials that were mentioned during the training? And then she continues, we are from a military school where we do trainings for the servicemen and for leaders, so it would be really good to have some tried and tested materials for our work. So this is related, I guess, to the training on stigma that you mentioned.
Yes, I would be happy to send you my materials. I will say that I should have presented this. There was a second iteration of the development of the training that was so kind of a modified version that was then tested on another sample with positive effects. So what I can do is I'm happy to send the training that we use, but I'll also reach out to the developers of the updated training, and I could send that to you, Oksana, in terms of the manuals that were used. and the videos, if they could potentially be translated, they may be helpful. I think they probably speak to some similar. We created a whole video on the malingering issue because of how important, how rampant that was, where leaders were saying that soldiers were going to mental health to get out of work, or to, and so we put together a video just on that issue. So I'm happy to share those as well.
Thank you very much. People are sending hearts to you if you see there are
yes,
hearts.
I do. That's very nice. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Шановні слухачі. Ага. One more heart is flying.
I had not seen the hearts before. I guess I had seen the clap, so that's nice.
Yeah.
Especially given the difficulty of the topic.
Yeah, the difficulty for attending as well, because we have a lot of people who watch the seminar after the recording is put to, yeah.
Well, and I think everyone has my, I'll just write my email address here, just in case that they can, I check email quite often, so I'm happy to respond to any follow-up questions.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for organizing this, Oksana, and Jim for, I guess you and Carl are kind of doing the whole series.
Well, we're attempting to identify people that we think can make a contribution, and you know, it's a sort of a rolling kind of thing. So if you have some individuals in mind that you think have topics that would be relevant and of interest, get back to Carl or get back to me. Yeah. You know, I think critically important. I had to step out for a moment. I have one question that you may have addressed, but I'd ask you to highlight it. And that's the issue of, you know, who do you see as the critical gatekeepers in units who can be trained to help facilitate, you know, this kind of access to care?
It's a great point. It's, you know, different leaders are probably important for different reasons, but the person that comes to mind is really the first sergeant of the company, in terms of because I did have a situation once where I wrote up a number to a behavioral health clinic and said, you know, you can call this number and to schedule an appointment. And the first sergeant said, well, and then I'll call and cancel the appointment. So it was clear that person was not creating a very positive within the unit.
And in a sense that you're describing, you know, the kind of people who create the culture of units.
Right.
Culture, even down to the small unit level, is critically important and can vary greatly depending on the attitude and the willingness of those you know, mid-level enlisted you know, service members who sort of control access, who say when you have to come up in the morning to go to work and what time you go home at night.
Right. That's a great point. I remember when we did the qualitative work, at that point in time, very senior leaders in the military had talked about their own experiences with mental health treatment. And I think the assumption was that would reduce the stigma. But then when you talked with the lower level leaders and service members, it hadn't gotten down to that level, probably because of the implications it has for unit functioning and ability to achieve the unit's mission, and the fact that, you know, so that there's often a shortage of personnel and that type of thing.
Yeah, especially if it involves people who have key responsibilities for weapon systems or communication, or if that person is away for any period of time, everyone can feel the, you know, the consequences of that.
That's a great point. Yes, that probably has a big effect on the disruption that would occur.
Так, мабуть, у нас питання вже.
We seem to have exhausted our questions. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your time. We're grateful to the interpreters who are with us today, and we're grateful to the participants who we are encouraging to join our upcoming events. We will be informing you about them on all of our channels. You will also need to know that you will get the recording of this webinar at the channel of for PostNGO. This is where you can find all of our meetings. There is a separate playlist, so please go back, look at these materials again and use them. Thomas also left his email, so in case you want to ask for materials, you can write directly to him. Thank you all, and I think this is where we can call it a day and wish everyone to have a good weekend.
All right, thank you. I appreciate you guys being here in the evening, and I look forward to hearing from some of you.
Okay. Probably it will be me. I'm going to write you and remind you about those materials that you said. Okay.
I will. Please do. Yes.
Fine. Okay. Have a good
Bye,
day.
everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.